Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
Story 1. Thomas Winters was 10 years old when he learned that time could bleed. The night had settled into his bedroom like a familiar friend, bringing with it the soft whispers of autumn leaves scratching against window panes like skeletal fingers. The furnace humming its ancient lullaby from the basement, and somewhere in the distance, a train's mournful whistle cutting through the October dark. The moon hung low and yellow like a cat's eye in the sky, casting shadows that seemed to breathe with each passing cloud. He shouldn't have been awake at all. Mother had been particularly stern about bedtime tonight, her voice carrying that edge it got when she was worried about something. "Lights out at 9, young man," she'd said, tucking the blankets around him with hands that trembled ever so slightly. No arguments tonight. Not tonight of all nights. But Thomas had his newest comic book hidden under his pillow, the strange one he'd found at the back of old Mr. Peterson's used bookstore. Its pages were yellowed and crackling with age. The cover showed soldiers marching through what looked like broken clocks, their faces hidden in shadow. He'd been drawn to it immediately, even though it cost him 3 weeks' allowance, and Mr. Peterson had given him an odd look when he bought it. Now at 9:43, by the luminous dial of his bedside clock, Thomas lay beneath his covers with a flashlight, devouring each panel. The story was confusing. Something about soldiers lost in time, hunting through history for pieces of a broken machine. The art was unlike anything he'd seen before, almost too realistic. The soldiers' uniforms spanning different eras, but their faces always hidden in shadow or turned away from the reader. He was so absorbed in the comic that at first he didn't notice the change in the house's rhythm. The furnace's hum had stopped. The autumn leaves no longer scratched at his window. Even the distant train seemed to have held its breath. The silence was absolute, pressing against his ears like cotton wool. Then came his mother's scream. It wasn't like the screams in movies, or the ones his little sister Alice made when she scraped her knee. This was primal, wet and wrong, like something trying to force its way out of a human throat that wasn't designed to carry such sounds. It came from his parents' bedroom, and it froze Thomas's blood in his veins. The comic book slipped from nerveless fingers as another scream followed, then the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. His father's voice rose in alarm, but the words were muffled through the walls. "Helen! Helen, they're here! They found—" Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as he slipped from his bed, bare feet silent on the carpeted floor. The house felt different now, as if all the familiar corners and shadows had shifted slightly, like a photograph taken from the wrong angle. The nightlight in his room, a steadfast guardian against childhood fears, began to flicker erratically. That's when he heard the boots. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy footfalls on the stairs, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Thomas had spent enough time watching war movies with his dad to recognize the rhythmic sound of combat boots. But there shouldn't be soldiers in their house. Not here. Not in peaceful Maple Street, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a tree. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise Thomas had ever heard. It was thick and sticky, like invisible syrup filling his ears. In that silence, he could hear other things. The soft click of doors being methodically opened and closed, the creak of floorboards beneath those heavy boots, and something else, a sound like radio static or the buzz of dying fluorescent lights, but somehow vertical, as if it were falling through the house like rain. His body moved on instinct, dropping to the floor and sliding under his bed, where shadows gathered like old friends. From this vantage point, he could see the strip of light under his door and the shadows that passed through it. The comic book lay just within reach, one page open to a panel showing a child hiding under a bed, and Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. The illustration was too familiar, too precise, right down to the pattern of his bedroom carpet. Thump, thump, thump. The boots were methodical, checking rooms. Thomas heard doors opening and closing. His sister's room was next door, but he hadn't heard a peep from little Alice all night. That thought sent ice water running down his spine. Alice always cried when she was scared. Always. She was only 6, and thunderstorms still sent her running to their parents' room. But now, when real terror walked the hallways of their home, she was silent. His bedroom door creaked open with agonizing slowness, each tiny sound stretching out like taffy. Black boots entered his field of vision. Not modern military boots, but old ones, the kind he'd seen in the World War II museum during last year's field trip. They were cracked and worn, caked with what looked like centuries of mud and something darker that flaked off onto his clean carpet. The boots stood still for a moment, and Thomas could hear something like breathing coming from above. But it was wrong, arrhythmic, as if the lungs drawing in air weren't quite the right shape. A drop of something dark fell from somewhere above, hitting the carpet with a soft pat. Where it landed, the fibers of the carpet seemed to age and fade before Thomas's eyes. "Come out, boy." The voice was wrong. It sounded like gravel being crushed under tank treads, like words spoken through lungs full of dirt. "We can smell your timeline on you. Sweet scent of the fragment, passed down through generations of your blood. Did they never tell you? Did they think they could hide you forever?" A hand shot under the bed, gray-skinned, with fingernails like yellowed ivory that had grown long and sharp. It grabbed Thomas's ankle and dragged him out in one swift motion. He screamed then, a high, piercing sound that died in his throat when he saw the thing that had caught him. The soldier, if it could be called that, wore a uniform that might once have been Feldgrau, now faded to the color of tombstones. His flesh had the consistency of wet clay, features running and shifting like wax under a flame. Only the eyes remained constant, black holes that seemed to swallow all light, all hope, all time. Looking into them, Thomas saw moments spinning past like leaves in a storm. Births, deaths, wars, peacetime, all flowing together in a dizzying stream. 200 years, the thing said, its mouth moving like a puppet's, tears of black fluid running from those terrible eyes. 200 years we've hunted your bloodline through the corridors of time. You carry it in you, the fragment of the device that scattered us across the centuries. Your great-great-great-grandmother thought she could destroy it, but she only broke it into pieces, shed it into her descendants like falling stars. Thomas tried to scramble backward, but more boots were entering his room, more soldiers, each one a horror of melted flesh and ancient uniforms from different eras. Wehrmacht gray mingling with Union blue, Revolutionary red, and others he couldn't identify. Their bodies flickered like bad television reception, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent enough to see the walls through their forms. Some wore uniforms he recognized from his history books, while others wore styles he'd never seen before, perhaps from wars that hadn't happened yet. "The Time Corps sends its regards," the first soldier said, reaching into its chest with those terrible fingers. They emerged holding something that glowed like the northern lights, swirling with colors that hurt Thomas's eyes to look at. "We've been trapped in between moments for so long, but you'll help us find our way home. All we need is what's inside you." Thomas thought of his mother's scream, his father's silence, little Alice's room so quiet next door. He thought of the comic books scattered on his bed and how he'd never know how the story ended. He thought of time itself, stretching out before and behind him like an endless highway, and these things that had walked it for 2 centuries, hunting his family. He thought of his mother's trembling hands at bedtime, how she must have known, must have sensed them getting closer. "Please," he whispered. But the soldiers were already reaching for him with their grave dirt hands, their bodies flickering between now and then, here and there, alive and dead. The comic book still lay open on the floor, its pages turning by themselves in a wind that smelled of dust and decay. The last page showed a boy being taken by soldiers, their faces finally revealed, timeless, ageless horrors wearing the masks of men. The last thing Thomas Winters saw before the timeline shattered around him was his bedroom clock striking 9:44, exactly 1 minute after his mother's first scream. In that moment, he understood what the soldiers meant about time bleeding. He could see it happening now, moments spilling into each other like wine into water, past and future, mixing until neither had any meaning. They had found him at last, these hunters from the edges of time, and as darkness took him, Thomas realized that the comic book he'd been reading wasn't just a story after all. It was a warning, printed on cheap paper and hidden in plain sight, trying to prepare him for this moment. But he turned the page too late, and now time itself had come to collect its due. In the Winters house on Maple Street, where autumn leaves still scratched at windows like skeletal fingers, the clock struck 9:45. The soldiers vanished, taking with them a boy who had lived 11 years in linear time and would now live countless more in the spaces between seconds. They left behind empty rooms and cooling bodies, a comic book with its pages fluttering in a wind that shouldn't exist indoors, and a story that would become neighborhood legend. Years later, children would dare each other to spend the night in the abandoned Winters house, swearing they could hear boots on the stairs and screams that lasted exactly 1 minute. But none of them ever found what they were looking for, because you can't find something that exists in all moments at once. And somewhere, in the spaces between time, a boy named Thomas Winters learned what it meant to be hunted across centuries, carrying within him a fragment of a device that could mend or break reality itself. But that's another story, one that hasn't happened yet, or perhaps happened long ago in the endless dance of moments where past and future bleed into one eternal now. The clock strikes 9:43, and somewhere a mother starts to scream. Story 2. The house stood precisely as Margaret remembered it from childhood, a looming Victorian monster with weathered gray shingles and black shutters that hung at slightly wrong angles, like crooked teeth in an old woman's smile. She had arrived first, as always. Eleanor and Catherine would be late, as always. Some patterns, she thought, survive even death. Grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, had insisted they meet at the house rather than his office. "Your grandmother's explicit instructions," he'd said over the phone, his voice crackling with static. Or perhaps it was age. Margaret couldn't tell anymore. At 78, he was nearly as old as grandmother had been when she died. The key was under the ceramic toad, just where it had always been. Margaret's fingers trembled as she lifted the worn figurine. The late October wind whipped her gray hair around her face, and she tucked it behind her ears with an impatient gesture she'd inherited from grandmother herself. The lock stuck, then turned with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, the foyer smelled of mothballs and funeral lilies. Margaret's sensible shoes clicked against the hardwood floors as she made her way to the parlor. The furniture wore white sheets like funeral shrouds, and dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains. A car door slammed outside, then another. "Maggie?" Eleanor's voice, still girlish at 63. "Are you here already?" "In the parlor," Margaret called back, though she knew Eleanor remembered the way they'd played here as children after all, always under grandmother's watchful eye. Eleanor entered first, her bottle blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her lipstick precise. Catherine followed, tall and stern in her judge's posture, though she'd retired from the bench 5 years ago. Neither sister had aged as well as Margaret. Their faces were too tight, too worked on, trying too hard to hold on to youth. "Well," Eleanor said, settling onto a sheet-covered chair without removing the cover. "Here we are." "Here we are?" Catherine echoed, remaining standing. She'd always loomed, even as a child. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 4 with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Right on time, Mr. Whitmore's car crunched up the gravel drive. They heard his slow, careful steps on the porch, then the sharp rap of his walking stick against the door. Margaret moved to let him in, but Catherine was faster, her long legs carrying her to the door in 4 precise steps. "Ladies," Mr. Whitmore said, nodding to each sister in turn. He carried a leather briefcase that looked as ancient as he was, the corners worn smooth and shiny. "Shall we begin?" He didn't wait for an answer, but made his way to grandmother's favorite chair, the only one without a dust cover, and settled in with a sigh that seemed to come from his bones. The briefcase clicked open with a sound like snapping fingers. "Your grandmother," he began, "was a woman of very particular tastes, and even more particular instructions." He withdrew a single envelope, cream-colored and sealed with red wax. "She left this letter, to be read to you and only you, in this room, at this hour, on this day." The sisters exchanged a look. Grandmother had always loved her theatrics. Mr. Whitmore broke the seal with one gnarled finger and withdrew a single sheet of paper. His voice, when he began to read, was stronger than it had any right to be. "My dearest granddaughters," he read, "if you are hearing this, then I am dead, and you are together again in my house. How long has it been since you were all in one room? 10 years? 15? Not since Catherine's wedding, I expect. The one that ended so unfortunately." Catherine's face tightened. Eleanor looked away. Margaret remembered the blood on the wedding dress, the screaming, the way the groom had never been found. "I have watched you grow from sweet little girls into bitter women," Mr. Whitmore continued reading. You have become everything I feared you might. Successful, yes, but hollow, empty, like gorgeous apples, all shine and no substance, rotten at the core. Eleanor made a small sound of protest, but Mr. Whitmore raised one trembling hand for silence. But I have not given up on you. In my jewelry box, the one with the silver filigree, you remember it, Margaret. You always did love to peek inside. You will find my grandmother's necklace. The diamonds, yes, Eleanor. The ones you've been eyeing since you were 12. The ones Catherine tried to steal when she was 17. The ones Margaret has already attempted to remove from the house twice since my death. Margaret felt her sister's eyes on her, but kept her face carefully blank. The necklace is yours, all of yours, but only one of you may have it, and you must decide amongst yourselves who that will be. You have until midnight. Mr. Whitmore will wait in his car. When you have decided, bring him your unanimous decision. If you cannot decide. Mr. Whitmore paused, licking his lips. Gee, if you cannot decide, the necklace will be donated to the museum, where none of you will ever touch it. He folded the letter carefully. I'll be in my car, he said, rising with difficulty. Remember, ladies, unanimous decision by midnight, or no one gets the necklace. The door closed behind him with a sound like a judge's gavel. For a long moment, none of the sisters spoke. The grandfather clock ticked in the hall, counting down their time. Well, Eleanor said finally, I suppose we should look at it first. She rose, smoothing her expensive skirt. Maggie, since you know where it is. Margaret led them upstairs, past the family portraits that seemed to watch them climb. The jewelry box sat on grandmother's dresser, exactly where it had always been. The silver filigree caught the dying light from the window, casting cobweb shadows on the wall. The necklace lay on black velvet, each diamond catching fire even in the dim room. Margaret lifted it carefully, letting the stones pool in her palm like trapped stars. Even Eleanor's careful makeup couldn't hide her sharp intake of breath. It's worth millions, Catherine said quietly. More, probably, given its provenance. The diamonds are from before they kept records of such things. I remember when she told us the story, Eleanor said, reaching out one manicured finger to touch the largest stone. How her grandmother got it from that Maharaja during the rebellion. How many people died for these diamonds, do you think? Fewer than will die for them now, Margaret said, and her sisters looked at her sharply. The sun was setting, painting the room in the shades of blood and gold. Soon it would be dark. We should discuss this downstairs, Catherine suggested, like civilized people. But they were already circling each other, like wolves who smelled weakness in the pack. I'm the oldest, Margaret said quietly. By rights. Rights? Eleanor laughed, high and sharp. What rights? You're the one who abandoned her. Moved across the country. Barely visited. I called every week, Margaret snapped. While you were too busy with your society parties and your string of husbands. At least I stayed married, Eleanor shot back. Unlike some people's daughters. Catherine moved fast for a woman her age. Her hand closed around the necklace in Margaret's palm, but Margaret's fingers tightened instinctively. Eleanor grabbed for it too, and suddenly they were all connected by the strand of diamonds, a circuit of greed and history and blood. Let go, Catherine growled. You let go, Eleanor panted. Margaret said nothing, but she didn't release her grip. The last ray of sunlight struck the diamonds, and for a moment they blazed like stars gone nova. Then darkness fell, and with it came a change. Later, none of them would be quite sure what happened next. The necklace grew hot in their hands, too hot to hold, but none of them could let go. The diamonds began to glow with an inner light, sickly and green, like swamp gas or corpse light. They heard grandmother's laugh then, or thought they did, that dry chuckle that had always preceded something terrible. The necklace moved. Oh, the diamonds flowed like mercury, spreading up their arms like living things, like parasites seeking blood. Eleanor screamed. Catherine tried to pull away. Margaret closed her eyes and accepted what was coming. The grandfather clock began to strike midnight, though it couldn't have been more than 5 o'clock. With each bell, a diamond detached itself from the necklace and burrowed into their flesh, under fingernails, between teeth, behind eyes. The pain was exquisite, transformative, terrible. When Mr. Whitmore entered the house at true midnight, he found 3 empty dresses arranged carefully on the parlor floor. The necklace lay between them, innocent as sin, every diamond in place. He picked it up carefully, using his handkerchief, and placed it back in its box. "Well, ladies," he said to the empty room, "I suppose this means the museum wins after all." As he drove away, he thought he saw 3 figures in the upstairs window, glittering faintly in the moonlight. But that was impossible, of course. Just a trick of the light reflecting off the diamonds that had once been 3 sisters who loved jewelry more than they loved each other. The house stood silent in the moonlight, its shutters hanging at wrong angles, like a smile that knows too much. Some patterns, after all, survive even death. Story 3. The first time it happened, Marcus thought it was just a technical glitch. The LCD screen on his Nikon D850 showed a perfectly composed shot of 2 elderly women weaving traditional blankets outside their home on the Pine Ridge Reservation. But when he checked the captured image, there were only empty wooden chairs and floating threads catching the late afternoon sun. He deleted the photo and tried again. The women smiled at him patiently as he adjusted his settings, thinking perhaps it was an exposure issue, but the result was the same. Empty chairs, animated threads moving through vacant air, and long shadows stretching across dust that held no footprints. "Must be something wrong with the sensor," he muttered, though in 15 years of professional photography, he'd never encountered anything like it. He thanked the women and moved on, making a mental note to check his equipment thoroughly that evening. Marcus had come to Pine Ridge with high hopes for his latest photography project. After years of shooting sterile corporate events and artificial wedding poses, he'd finally secured a grant to document daily life on America's reservations. He envisioned a raw, honest portrayal of modern Native American life, the struggles, the traditions, the resilience. What he didn't envision was his camera refusing to capture human subjects. The problem persisted throughout the afternoon. A group of teenagers playing basketball became an empty court with a ball suspended in mid-air. A man chopping wood transformed into an axe floating above a stump. Every single human subject vanished from his frames, leaving behind only their interactions with the physical world, ghost-like impressions of life without the living. That evening in his rented room at the reservation's only motel, Marcus connected his camera to his laptop. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the day's shots. The technical data was perfect. Exposure, focus, everything exactly as it should be. But the people were gone. Every single one. He pulled up his earlier work from the trip here. The shots from the gas station off the highway were normal. So were the photos of the diner where he'd stopped for lunch. The anomaly had only started when he crossed onto reservation land. A knock at his door broke his concentration. It was Jerry T. Hawks, a tribal elder he'd met that morning, who had agreed to be his guide during his stay. "Thought I'd check how your first day went," Jerry said, his weathered face creasing with a warm smile. "Get any good shots?" Marcus hesitated, then turned his laptop to show him. "Something strange is happening with my camera. See these chairs? There were 2 women sitting there when I took this, and here, this basketball court was full of kids." Jerry's smile faded as he scrolled through the photos. The room seemed to grow colder as silence stretched between them. "You should pack up and leave," Jerry finally said, his voice flat. "First light tomorrow, earlier if you can manage it." "What?" "But I just got here, my grant." "Some stories aren't meant to be told by outsiders," Jerry said. His eyes, previously friendly, had turned hard as flint. "Some things aren't meant to be captured." "I don't understand," Jerry sighed heavily, settling into the room's only chair. "There's an old story among our people. When the first cameras were brought to our lands, the elders warned that these machines could steal more than just images. They said that every photograph taken without permission, without understanding, without respect for our ways, it took something from us, something vital." Marcus thought about the missing people in his photos. "But that's just a story, right? I mean, other photographers have worked here before." "Have they?" Jerry raised an eyebrow. "Show me their photos. Show me one clear image of our people, taken by an outsider, that truly captures who we are." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then slowly closed it. He realized he'd seen plenty of landscapes from the reservation, plenty of artifacts and buildings, but the people in such photos were always somehow obscured, turned away from the camera, hidden in shadow, or blurred by motion. "The camera doesn't lie, they say." Jerry stood up. "But the truth it tells isn't always the one you're looking for. Sometimes it shows you what you've been blind to all along." After Jerry left, Marcus couldn't sleep. He spent hours researching online, looking for photos of Pine Ridge residents. What he found disturbed him deeply. In image after image, he noticed the same pattern. People who seemed to fade into their surroundings, faces that never quite came into focus, bodies that appeared almost translucent. Around 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep and decided to review his photos again. As he scrolled through them in the blue glow of his laptop, something new caught his eye. In each image, the shadows seemed longer than they had before, darker. They stretched toward the camera like grasping fingers, and they were moving. Marcus slammed the laptop shut, his heart pounding. When he opened it again, the shadows were normal, but now he noticed something else. In the metadata for each photo, under Subjects Detected, his camera had logged the same number over and over, -1. Telling himself he was being ridiculous, that lack of sleep was making him paranoid, Marcus picked up his camera and pointed it at the mirror. He needed to prove to himself that it could still capture normal photos of people. The viewfinder showed his reflection clearly. His tired eyes, his disheveled hair, the tension in his jaw. He pressed the shutter. The preview appeared on the LCD screen. The mirror was there, reflecting the empty room. Where his reflection should have been, there was only a deep, dark shadow, somehow darker than the unlit corners of the room. And it was smiling. Marcus dropped the camera and ran. He made it halfway to his rental car before he realized he'd left his keys in the room. Standing in the parking lot under a sky scattered with stars, he felt eyes on him from every direction. The darkness between the buildings seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Jerry, but not Jerry. The form was right, but it was composed entirely of darkness, like a hole cut in the shape of a man. "I told you to leave," the shadow that was Jerry said, "but you wanted to keep looking. Keep taking. Keep stealing pieces of us to show to the world." More shadows peeled away from the darkness, dozens of them, hundreds, all the missing people from his photographs. But they weren't missing anymore. They were right here, surrounding him, their edges bleeding into the night. "We've been patient," the shadows whispered in 1,000 overlapping voices. "We've hidden ourselves away, let you take your empty pictures, tell your empty stories, but you keep coming back, keep trying to capture us, pin us down, define us through your lens." Marcus tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The shadows were at his feet now, twining around his ankles like smoke. "So now we'll show you what it's like," they said. "To be captured, to be seen but not understood, to be nothing but an empty frame for someone else's story." The last photo found on Marcus Henderson's camera showed the motel parking lot under a brilliant desert moon. The asphalt was cracked and empty, except for a single shadow that shouldn't have been there. A photographer's silhouette, forever frozen in a pose of terror, with no one there to cast it. His rental car was discovered 3 days later at a gas station just outside the reservation. The security camera footage showed it pulling in at 3:47 a.m., but the driver's seat appeared empty. The door opened and closed on its own. The gas cap unscrewed itself, and money was left on the counter to pay for a full tank. To this day, if you visit Pine Ridge Reservation and try to take photos of the locals, you might notice something odd about your pictures. And if you look carefully at the shadow in those empty frames, you might see a familiar shape, a man with a camera, still trying to capture the truth, forever part of the story he tried to tell. Just don't look too long. The shadows have learned to look back, and they're always eager to welcome new perspectives. Story 4. Denise Conway stood in what would become the lobby of the Healing House Inn, watching dust motes dance in the weak February sunlight. The real estate agent had left them alone to get a feel for the place, but what Denise felt mostly was cold. A kind of deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep up through the soles of her boots and settle in her bones. "Mike?" Her voice echoed slightly in the vast, empty space. "Come look at this." Her husband appeared from what had once been the admitting office of the Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, wiping cobwebs from his jacket sleeve. "Find something interesting?" Denise pointed to a dark stain on the hardwood floor, about the size of a dinner plate. "What do you think that is?" Mike crouched down, running his fingers over the discolored wood. "Water damage, probably. Place has been empty since '96, bound to be some wear and tear." He stood, brushing off his hands. "Nothing we can't fix." Denise wasn't so sure. The stain didn't look like water damage to her. It looked almost like... But no, That was ridiculous. She was letting the building's history get to her. "Honey?" Mike's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You still want to do this?" Denise looked around the space again, trying to see past the decay to what could be. The bones of the building were good, great even. Soaring ceilings, intricate woodwork, those gorgeous tall windows. Sure, it would take work, a lot of work and money. And there were the stories, of course, the rumors about why Millbrook had really closed down. But every small town had stories like that, didn't they? "Yes," she said firmly. "This is our chance, Mike. Properties like this don't come along every day, especially not at this price." Mike smiled, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I just worry about the history, you know. People might not want to stay in a former healing facility," Denise cut in. "That's how we'll market it. The healing house. It's perfect. We're giving the building a second chance, just like the doctors here used to give people second chances." Mike's smile turned genuine. "You always know how to spin things, don't you?" He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "All right, let's do it. What's the worst that could happen?" Standing there in the dusty sunlight, Denise couldn't have known that those words would come back to haunt them. Couldn't have known that some stains go deeper than wood, that some histories refuse to stay buried, that some second chances come with terrible prices. But she would learn. The renovation took 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Denise kept track in a little notebook, marking off each small victory. Day 23, electricity restored. Day 47, plumbing operational in West Wing. Day 89, first room completely renovated. She tried not to mark down the other things, the strange things, the tools that disappeared only to reappear days later in completely different parts of the building. The footsteps they heard at night when they were supposedly alone. The way some rooms just wouldn't warm up, no matter how high they set the heat. "Old buildings make weird noises," Mike would say whenever she brought it up. "It's just settling." But buildings didn't settle in ways that sounded like whispered conversations. They didn't leave fingerprints in the dust that had just been cleaned away. They didn't make you feel like you were being watched every time you turned your back. The workers noticed too. They started leaving early, making excuses about other jobs. 3 quit outright after spending time in the East Wing, though none would say exactly why. The last one, a burly electrician named Pete, had simply shaken his head as he packed up his tools. "Some places," he'd said, not quite meeting Denise's eyes, "some places just don't want to be changed, you know?" But Denise refused to give up. She'd sunk everything into this project, their savings, their future, their dreams. So she learned to ignore the whispers, to avoid looking too long at shadows that moved when they shouldn't, to tell herself that the occasional cry in the night was just the wind. By December, the Healing House Inn was ready to open. They'd preserved much of the original architecture while thoroughly modernizing the interior. The 20 guest rooms were tastefully appointed with period-appropriate furniture and modern amenities. The grounds had been landscaped, the facade restored to its former glory. If you didn't know what the building used to be, you'd never guess its history. Almost never. Their first booking came through on a Tuesday morning. Denise was updating their website when the notification pinged. Reservation request. Room 217. Guest name, Eleanor Vance. Check-in. Friday, December 13th. Notes. Former patient looking forward to coming home. Denise's finger hovered over the confirm button. Former patient. That had to be a joke, right? The hospital had closed nearly 30 years ago, but the deposit had already cleared, and they desperately needed the income. What harm could one guest do? She clicked confirm. That night she dreamed of the stain in the lobby. In the dream, it wasn't a stain at all, but a hole, deep and dark and endless, and something was climbing out. Eleanor Vance arrived exactly at 3 p.m. on Friday the 13th, as the weak winter sun was already beginning to set. She was older than Denise had expected, perhaps in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a dark blue dress that might have been fashionable 2 decades ago and carried only a small leather suitcase that looked even older. "Welcome to the healing house," Denise said brightly from behind the front desk, trying to ignore the way her heart was suddenly racing. There was something about Eleanor's eyes. They seemed to look through her rather than at her. "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "How lovely to see it all again. You've made some changes." She turned slowly in place, examining the lobby. "Though not as many as you think." Mike emerged from the back office, apparently drawn by the voices. "Can I help with your bag, Miss Vance?" Eleanor clutched her suitcase tighter. "No, thank you. I know the way." She paused, then added, "I spent quite a lot of time in room 217, you see, before the treatments." Denise's hand trembled slightly as she held out the key, the original brass key, carefully restored like so much else in the building. "The room has been completely renovated, has it?" Eleanor interrupted, taking the key. Her fingers were ice cold where they brushed Denise's. "We'll see about that, won't we?" She started up the main staircase, her shoes clicking against the wooden steps. Just before she disappeared around the corner, she called back. "Oh, and you might want to check the lobby floor. That stain. It never quite comes out, no matter how hard they scrub." Denise and Mike exchanged glances. "Maybe this wasn't," Mike began. "We can't afford to turn away guests," Denise cut him off. "She's probably just interested in the history, like you said before. We'll get some of those." But later that night, as she lay awake listening to the sounds of the old building, Denise couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just made a terrible mistake. Above their ground floor apartment, footsteps paced back and forth, back and forth. Room 217 was directly overhead. The footsteps continued until dawn. The next morning, Denise found Eleanor sitting in the dining room, perfectly still, staring out the tall windows at the frost-covered garden. She hadn't touched the continental breakfast laid out before her. "Did you sleep well, Miss Vance?" Denise asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Eleanor smiled, still gazing out the window. "Oh, I haven't slept in years, dear. Not since the treatments." She turned then, and Denise had to fight the urge to step back. In the harsh morning light, Eleanor's skin seemed almost translucent, the blue veins beneath standing out like roads on a map. "You know what they did to us here in the quiet hours before dawn?" Denise swallowed hard. "I'm not sure They said they could fix us," Eleanor continued, as if Denise hadn't spoken. "Dr. Morrison had such grand ideas about healing, about pushing the boundaries of treatment." She laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves scraping across pavement. "Do you know what the human mind looks like when it breaks, Mrs. Conway? It's quite beautiful in its way, like watching ice crack on a frozen pond. First one small fissure, then another, until the whole surface is webbed with breaks. And then she made a soft popping sound with her lips. Down you go, into the cold, dark water below. Denise's mouth had gone dry. Miss Vance, I think perhaps... They're waking up now, Eleanor interrupted again, turning back to the window. Can't you feel it? All those broken minds, all those shattered souls. You opened the doors, you see. You invited us back in. She smiled, showing too many teeth. We've been so patient, waiting all these years. And now, a crash from the kitchen made Denise jump. She hurried to investigate, grateful for the excuse to escape Eleanor's presence. She found a coffee cup shattered on the floor, coffee spreading across the tiles like dark blood. But she'd been alone in the kitchen, and the cup had been nowhere near the edge of the counter where it now lay in pieces. When she returned to the dining room, Eleanor was gone. Her breakfast sat untouched. The orange juice in her glass was somehow frozen solid, despite the warmth of the room. Throughout the day, small things kept going wrong. Light bulbs would burn out moments after being replaced. Water from the taps ran brown, then clear, then brown again. The heat would cut out in one room while making another unbearably hot. Denise told herself it was just new building jitters, just systems settling in. But then the whispers started. At first, they were easy to dismiss, just the wind in the old ventilation system, surely. But they grew clearer as the day wore on. Snippets of conversations that seemed to come from empty rooms. Time for your medicine, please. Not again. Hold her down. It's for your own good. Mike found Denise in the front office around sunset, her hands shaking as she tried to update their booking spreadsheet. Have you seen Miss Vance? He asked. I wanted to check if she needs anything, but she's not answering her door. Denise shook her head. Not since breakfast. She hesitated, then added, Mike, I think something's wrong. The noises, and I keep seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Before she could finish, all the lights in the building went out at once. In the sudden darkness, they heard Eleanor's voice, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Time for evening therapy, dear. Dr. Morrison always said nighttime was best for breakthroughs. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly green glow. And that's when the screaming began. It started in room 217, a high, keening wail that made Denise's teeth ache. But it was quickly joined by other voices, screams and sobs and hysterical laughter echoing through the halls. The sound seemed to be coming from every room, every corner, every shadow. Even the rooms they knew were empty. We need to get out, Mike said, grabbing Denise's arm. Now. But as they turned toward the front door, they found Eleanor standing there. Only she wasn't quite Eleanor anymore. Her flesh had turned gray and sunken. Her hospital gown. When had she changed into a hospital gown, stained with old blood? Behind her, shadows rose and twisted, taking on almost human shapes. But you can't leave, she said, her voice distorting like a broken record. The session's just beginning, and Dr. Morrison always said... Her face split into that too wide smile. Attendance is mandatory. The shadows surged forward, and Denise finally understood what Eleanor had meant about minds breaking like ice. She could feel the cracks starting, spreading, splintering. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was Eleanor's voice, soft and almost kind. Don't worry, dear. Everyone's broken here. You'll fit right in. They found the Conways' car still parked outside the Healing House Inn 3 days later, frost coating the windows despite the unseasonably warm December weather. The building itself was empty, though the police reported strange noises during their search, and 3 officers requested transfers immediately afterward. No trace of Eleanor Vance was ever found. When investigators dug into the hospital's records, they discovered something troubling. A patient by that name had indeed stayed in room 217 in 1987. She had died during an experimental treatment conducted by a Dr. James Morrison, who himself vanished shortly before the hospital's closure in 1996. The Healing House Inn never opened again, but locals say that on quiet nights you can still see lights moving in the windows. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear singing, an old lullaby performed by many voices, all slightly out of sync. They say if you listen long enough, you might hear other things too. A scratch of pen on paper, as though someone is still keeping track of days in a little notebook. The click of heels on hardwood floors, the sound of a key turning in a lock. And sometimes, just sometimes, you might hear a woman's voice, crackling like an old recording. "Welcome to the Healing House. We're ready for your treatment now." The stain in the lobby grew a little larger every year, and no amount of scrubbing ever made it go away. Story 5. Old houses hold secrets in their bones. Sarah knew this the way children know things, not through learning, but through that peculiar wisdom that adults spend their whole lives trying to forget. Their Victorian home on Sycamore Street had stood for over a century, its gabled windows watching the world with patient, dark-rimmed eyes. But it wasn't the house's secrets that kept Sarah awake at night. It was the closet. More specifically, what lived inside it. The closet had always been different from other closets, even before Emily disappeared. It had possessed a certain wrongness that Sarah couldn't quite name. The door never hung quite straight, no matter how many times Father adjusted the hinges. The brass knob felt perpetually cold, even in the sweltering heat of August. And sometimes, if you looked at it from the corner of your eye, the gap beneath the door seemed deeper than it should be, as if it opened onto something vastly more distant than the floor of a children's bedroom. Sarah remembered the day they'd moved in, 4 years ago, when she was barely 3. Emily, 8 then, and full of that particular brightness that only eldest children possess, had claimed the room immediately. "It's perfect," she declared, spinning in circles until her pigtails flew out like windmill blades. "It's exactly like something from a story." Mother had laughed, brushing dust from the window seat. "Which story would that be, sweetheart?" Emily had stopped spinning then, her face suddenly serious in that way that used to make Sarah's stomach feel funny, like she'd swallowed a butterfly. "I don't know yet," she'd said, "but I think it wants to tell me." 3 months later, Emily vanished. The morning it happened had been ordinary in every way that mattered. February sunshine had painted weak rectangles on the hardwood floors. The radiator had been clicking and whistling its usual winter song. Sarah remembered sitting in her high chair, methodically dismantling a waffle into precisely squared pieces, when Mother's scream had shattered the quiet. Emily's bed hadn't been slept in. The covers were still pulled tight, hospital corners perfect, pillow undisturbed. Her favorite stuffed rabbit, a threadbare thing she'd named Mr. Whiskers, sat precisely in the center, as if placed there with deliberate care. The only thing out of place had been the closet door, standing open just wide enough to suggest an invitation. The search had consumed their small town for months. Sarah remembered fragments of that time, like scenes from a broken film reel. The blue and red lights of police cars staining the snow outside their windows. Mother's face appearing on television, pleading for information. Father's hands shaking as he hung up missing person posters. The way the neighbors would fall silent when their family walked past. Their pity hanging in the air like the smell before rain. But what Sarah remembered most clearly were the whispers that began 6 months after Emily disappeared. They came at night, slipping under the closet door like smoke, speaking in a voice that sounded almost but not quite like her sister's. At first, Sarah thought she was dreaming. She was 4 by then, old enough to understand that Emily was gone, but young enough to still believe in magic. The whispers would start just as she was drifting off to sleep, so quiet she had to hold her breath to hear them. Sarah, do you remember the games we used to play? She would lie very still, her small heart fluttering like a trapped bird, watching the strip of darkness beneath the closet door. Sometimes she thought she saw movement there, a shadow passing back and forth, or perhaps just the shadow of a passing. It went on like this for months. The whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They began to tell her things, secret things, things that made her skin prickle with a mixture of fear and fascination. They told her about the spaces between spaces, about the creatures that lived in the dark behind the doors, about deals made in whispers and promises sealed with something thicker than blood. One night, a week before her 5th birthday, Sarah finally whispered back, "Emily, is that really you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, something moved in the darkness beneath the door. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was an absence of shadow, a piece of darkness that was somehow darker than the dark around it, and it had far too many angles to be a child's silhouette. "Not just me," came the reply in a voice that was Emily's, and yet not Emily's at all. "Never just me, not anymore. But soon it will be your birthday, little sister, and then you can see for yourself." That had been the beginning. Every year since then, on Sarah's birthday, the closet door would open at exactly midnight. Emily would step out, eternally 8 years old, wearing the blue nightgown she disappeared in. Each visit brought subtle changes, her skin growing more translucent, her eyes reflecting light in ways human eyes shouldn't, her voice carrying echoes of places that had never known sunlight. And each year she brought a gift, always a drawing, always done in a material Sarah couldn't quite identify, showing scenes that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The first had been simple, 2 girls holding hands, beside a tall, angular figure. The second had shown the same scene, but the girls were standing in front of an open door, and the tall figure's smile contained too many teeth. The third had depicted what looked like a game of hide and seek, but the hiding places weren't in any house Sarah recognized, and the seekers had too many limbs. Now Sarah was 7, and tonight was her birthday. The autumn wind played funeral dirges in the chimney, and leaves scratched against her window like skeletal fingers seeking entrance. She lay in bed, watching the closet door with the patient attention of a child who has learned that the monster under the bed isn't nearly as dangerous as the one that comes bearing gifts. The digital clock on her nightstand read 11:59 p.m. Sarah counted the seconds in her head, remembering how Emily had taught her to count backward from 10 before their parents would check their rooms at night. 10. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. 9. The temperature dropped just enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. 8. The brass doorknob of the closet began to turn, moving with deliberate slowness. 7. Sarah could hear whispers now, but they weren't coming from under the door anymore. They seemed to be coming from inside her own head. 6. The door began to open, moving with that impossible smoothness that suggested hinges obeying laws of physics that Einstein never dreamed of. 5. Emily stepped out, more transparent than ever, the pattern of her nightgown visible through her chest like a faded photograph. 4. Behind her, something else moved in the darkness of the closet, unfolding itself with geometric precision. 3. Emily's smile was gentle, loving, and utterly wrong on a face that had stopped aging 6 years ago. 2. The thing behind her reached out with one of its many limbs, offering something that writhed and shifted like a living shadow. 1. "Happy birthday, Sarah," Emily said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. "Our friend has been so patient, waiting all these years. They think you're finally ready now, ready to understand what they showed me, ready to play the games that never have to end." The thing in the closet stepped fully into the room, its form suggesting angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Its face was a child's drawing of a face, done in lines of pure darkness, but its smile stretched wide enough to swallow the world. "Look what they helped me make for you," Emily continued, gesturing to the thing the creature held. It was another drawing, but this one seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Or perhaps it was absorbing the light around it, creating a whole in reality shaped like art. "This one shows what could be," Emily whispered. "What will be, if you're brave enough, if you're ready to understand why I chose to stay. Why being 8 forever isn't such a terrible thing when you have the right friends to play with." Sarah stared at the drawing. In it, she could see 3 figures, 2 small, 1 impossibly tall, all holding hands before an open door that seemed to lead into forever. The longer she looked, the more details emerged, shadows that danced at the edges of her vision, suggestions of movement in the static image, hints of places and things that her mind skittered away from like a mouse avoiding a cat's gaze. "Take it," Emily urged, her form flickering like a candle in a draft. "Take it, and then take my hand. I've missed you so much, Sarah. Missed our games, our secrets, our silly songs before bedtime. Our friend can give us that again, forever this time. No more growing up, no more getting old, no more saying goodbye. Just endless games in endless dark, where time can't touch us and death itself is just another playmate." The thing from the closet nodded, its movement causing ripples in the fabric of reality. Its smile widened impossibly further, revealing teeth that looked like shards of starless sky. Sarah looked at the drawing again. She thought about Mother, who still sat 3 places at dinner sometimes, before catching herself and putting 1 plate away. About Father, who couldn't bear to look at photographs anymore, but couldn't bear to take them down either. About the empty chair at school assemblies, the gap in family photos, the silence where a sister's laugh should be. Then she thought about being 8 forever, about playing games in spaces where geometry was more a suggestion than a law, about having a big sister again. Even if that sister now cast no shadow and played with things that lived in the dark. Sarah reached out her hand. The next morning, Mother found 2 empty beds. The closet door stood open just wide enough to suggest an invitation, and on Sarah's pillow lay a collection of drawings. The oldest was yellow with age, its simple figures holding hands before a door. The newest seemed to move under the weak morning light, showing 3 shapes playing an eternal game of hide and seek in places where light had never learned to shine. They searched, of course. The whole town searched. But eventually the posters with Sarah's gap-toothed smile began to yellow and curl at the edges, just like Emily's had. And people stopped asking questions they couldn't bear to hear the answers to. And in the spaces between spaces, behind doors that open unto darkness, 2 sisters play eternal games with their long-limbed friend, waiting for another birthday, another visit, another chance to share their gift with someone else who might be ready to understand the price of forever. If you press your ear to the closet door in that empty bedroom on a quiet night, you might hear them laughing. But be careful not to listen too long or too carefully, because sometimes, just sometimes, they might hear you too. And they're always looking for new friends to join their endless game of hide and seek in the dark. After all, what child hasn't wished at least once to stay young forever? And in that house on Sycamore Street, with its gabled windows and its closet that's never quite right, such wishes have a way of coming true, for a price that only seems steep if you're old enough to know better. Story 6. We bought the house because of the tree. That's what I tell myself now, lying awake at night listening to the scraping of branches against the window pane. Martha insisted it was the wraparound porch that sold her, and David claimed it was the price, but I know better. It was the tree, the magnificent acacia that dominated the backyard, its branches reaching toward the sky like supplicant hands. The adoption agency approved us 3 weeks after we moved in. The timing seemed perfect then, as if the universe had finally aligned in our favor after 8 years of failed fertility treatments and crushed hopes. Now, I understand it was something else entirely. The tree was waiting. They brought Ethan to us on a Tuesday. He was small for 7, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of silence. The social worker handed me his file, abandoned at 3, shuttled between foster homes, selective mutism. "He'll need patience," she said, her voice dripping with carefully measured sympathy and understanding. What she didn't say was that he'd spend hours standing beneath the acacia tree, his small face turned upward, lips moving in a silent conversation. She didn't warn us about the way he'd press his palms against its bark, or how he'd collect its fallen flowers and arrange them in precise patterns on his bedroom floor. The first time I found him there, speaking to the tree in whispers, I pretended not to notice the way the branches seemed to bend toward him as if listening. David said I was imagining things. Trees don't move without wind. But there was something in his voice, a tremor of uncertainty that made me wonder if he'd seen it too. Ethan's drawings changed after the first month. What started as typical child's art, stick figures and square houses, evolved into intricate patterns of roots and branches, always centered around a towering tree. In each picture, a small, dark figure stood beneath it, arms raised in what could have been celebration or supplication. When I asked him about them, He'd only smile that strange, knowing smile that made him look far older than his years. The dreams began in autumn. I'd wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, haunted by visions of roots breaking through our basement floor, of branches threading through our walls like veins. In my dreams, Ethan would stand in the backyard, but when he turned to face me, his eyes were hollow, filled with crawling things. It was around this time that Sarah started visiting. I never saw her arrive or leave. She was simply there. Sometimes a girl of perhaps 12 or 13, sitting with Ethan beneath the tree. When I asked the neighbors about her, they looked confused. The Henderson girl? They moved away years ago, after the accident. I found Ethan's journal hidden beneath his mattress while changing his sheets. The pages were filled with cramped, desperate writing. The same phrases repeated over and over. She says, I'm special. She says, I'm like her. She says, the tree remembers. Between the words were drawings of ants, hundreds of them, marching across the pages in endless columns. The pregnancy test came back positive in December. When I told David, he wept with joy, but Ethan's reaction was different. He stood very still, staring at my still flat stomach with an expression I couldn't read. That night I dreamed of roots wrapping around my ankles, pulling me into soft, dark earth that smelled of decay and something sweeter. Acacia flowers. The tree bloomed out of season, great clusters of yellow flowers appearing overnight. The air became thick with their scent, cloying and ever-present. Ethan spent more time outside, even as the weather turned bitter cold. I'd watch from the kitchen window as he and Sarah stood beneath the branches, their heads close together, sharing secrets I couldn't hear. I found the first ant in my bedroom, crawling across my pillow. Then another in the bathroom, and 3 more in the kitchen. Within days, they were everywhere, appearing in impossible places, inside sealed containers, between the pages of books, swimming in my morning coffee. David called an exterminator, but the man left, looking puzzled, saying he couldn't find any nest, any point of entry. The baby started kicking at 5 months. Ethan knew before I did, placing his hand on my stomach with that same unsettling smile. The tree is happy, he said, speaking directly to me for the first time in weeks. It's growing, too. I began to notice changes in the house itself. The walls seemed to pulse sometimes, like a living thing, breathing. The wood of the floor developed new patterns, swirls that looked almost like faces when viewed from certain angles. The basement filled with a web of roots that hadn't been there before, threading through the concrete like dark veins. Sarah stopped coming around the same time I found the dead birds. They appeared every morning, arranged in precise circles around the tree's trunk, their wings spread as if in flight. When I asked Ethan about them, he said, "They're offerings. Sarah says we need to feed it." 7 months into the pregnancy, I woke to find Ethan standing over my bed, his hands covered in dirt, acacia flowers woven into his hair. "It's not fair," he whispered, reaching toward my swollen belly. I was here first. The next morning, there were dirty handprints on my sheets, but Ethan was sleeping peacefully in his bed, clean and innocent. David started sleeping in the guest room, claiming my tossing and turning kept him awake. But I saw the way he looked at Ethan, the way he flinched when our son reached for him. Something was changing in my husband, just as something was changing in our home. in the very air we breathed. The dreams grew worse. I saw Sarah now, her face pale and wrong, her mouth full of ants. She would lead Ethan by the hand, deeper and deeper into the earth, while the tree's roots wrapped around them like loving arms. I'd try to scream, to run after them, but the ground would swallow me too, filling my mouth with sweet-smelling soil. I found Ethan's second journal in March, hidden inside the hollow of the tree. The writing was different here, more frantic, interspersed with drawings of what looked like human figures buried in root systems. "The tree remembers," he'd written. "The tree keeps what it loves. Sarah says I'll understand soon." The baby came early, during the storm that made the acacia tree thrash and moan like a living thing in pain. While I labored, Ethan sat in the backyard, letting the rain soak him to the skin, his eyes fixed on my hospital room window. The nurses tried to bring him inside, but he'd scream when they touched him, a sound that made the lights flicker and the monitor skip. We named her Lucy, this tiny, perfect thing that had grown inside me. Ethan wouldn't look at her directly, but I caught him standing over her crib at night, his fingers tracing patterns in the air above her face. The mobile we'd hung would spin without wind, and Lucy would wake crying, her small fists full of acacia flowers that hadn't been there when we put her to bed. Sarah appeared more frequently now, her form becoming more substantial with each visit. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her through the windows, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes full of a hunger I couldn't understand. The ants followed in her wake, trailing across windowsills and door frames in elaborate designs that looked almost like words. The day I found Ethan trying to bury Lucy's favorite stuffed animal beneath the tree was the day I decided the tree had to go. David argued against it, his face pale with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "We can't," he kept saying. "You don't understand what might happen." But I did understand. I understood with a clarity that cut through months of fog and confusion. The tree was taking my son, just as it had taken Sarah, just as it would take Lucy if we let it. I waited until Ethan was at school, then took David's chainsaw from the garage. The first cut drew sap that smelled like copper and salt. The second brought a sound that might have been the wind, might have been a child's scream. By the third, Ethan was there, though school couldn't possibly have ended yet. He stood at the edge of the yard, Sarah beside him, both of their faces masks of fury. What happened next comes to me in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror catching light. Ethan running toward me, the chainsaw's roar, a splash of red against white bark, Sarah's laugh, high and wild, the ground opening beneath us like a mouth, David's hands pulling me back, pushing Ethan down, the sound of metal against bone, the taste of soil and flowers. We planted roses where the tree had stood, but they died within days, their stems black and twisted. The ants came again, spelling out messages I refused to read. Lucy learned to walk, then talk, her first word being a name she shouldn't have known. Ethan. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I think I can hear him. His voice comes up through the floorboards, through the walls, through the roots that still thread through our basement. He's talking to Sarah, to the others the tree has taken, to the thing that the tree has become. And sometimes, when I look out at our perfect, empty backyard, I see new growth breaking through the soil. Small, delicate acacia shoots reaching for the sky like children's hands. David says we should move, but we both know it wouldn't matter. The tree is inside us now, its roots wrapped around our hearts, its flowers blooming behind our eyes. Ethan isn't lost. He's waiting. And one day, when Lucy is old enough to understand, she'll walk into the garden and listen to her brother's voice carried on the wind through phantom acacia flowers. After all, the tree remembers. The tree keeps what it loves. And we who fed it with our love and our lies and our loss will always belong to it, our guilt growing like roots through the foundations of our lives, reaching ever deeper into the dark, fertile soil of our secrets. Some nights I still check Lucy's room, counting her breaths, watching for ants marching across her windowsill. And sometimes, in the moment between sleeping and waking, I swear I see Ethan and Sarah standing at the foot of her bed, their faces young and ancient all at once, acacia flowers woven in their hair, waiting to welcome her into their endless garden. But these are just stories I tell myself in the dark. The truth is simpler and more terrible. We bought the house because of the tree, and the tree, patient and hungry, bought us with promises of the family we so desperately wanted. It's still waiting, its roots spreading beneath our feet, its branches reaching toward our windows like supplicant hands. After all, every garden needs tending, every tree needs feeding, and every family has its secrets buried deep where the roots can reach them. Story 7. There exists in the peculiar profession of portrait painting a certain intimacy between artist and subject that borders on the metaphysical. I have often thought that we painters are not merely capturing the external visage of our sitters, but something far, far more essential, perhaps even their souls. It was this very notion that would come to haunt me most exquisitely in the winter of 1888, when I received a most unusual commission that would forever alter my understanding of art, life, and the tenuous boundary between them. That year had been particularly trying for London's artistic community. The advent of photography had begun to steal away many of our traditional patrons, and several of my colleagues had already abandoned their studios for more profitable pursuits. I, however, maintained that there was something a camera could never capture, the ineffable quality of human presence that only emerged through hours of careful observation and the patient application of paint to canvas. My studio, a converted attic space in Mayfair, had witnessed the slow decay of my profession. Where once I had entertained a steady stream of nobility and nouveau riche alike, now I found myself increasingly dependent on the patronage of eccentric collectors and those few who still believed in the superiority of painted portraits. The space itself seemed to reflect this decline. The once pristine skylights had gathered a film of London's perpetual grime, casting everything in a slightly muted pallor that no amount of cleaning could fully dispel. I had taken to working increasingly by lamplight, finding that the artificial illumination lent my subjects a certain dramatic quality that seemed to appeal to my dwindling clientele. The dancing flames created shadows that suggested depths beneath the surface of my sitters' faces, hinting at secrets that daylight might have rendered too stark or obvious. It was perhaps this very practice that drew him to my door. The day Master Sebastian Vale first appeared began ordinarily enough. I had spent the morning attempting to capture the likeness of a merchant's wife, a tedious commission that left me feeling rather hollow. The woman had insisted on being painted with various symbols of her husband's wealth surrounding her. Gilt-framed mirrors, imported vases, and a particularly garish Persian carpet that I suspected was rather less authentic than she believed. As she departed, leaving behind the cloying scent of French perfume, I found myself longing for a subject of true substance. The fog had begun its nightly invasion of London's streets when the first knock came at my door. It was not the usual timid rap of a potential client, nor the confident pound of a regular patron. Rather, it was 3 sharper raps, evenly spaced, delivered with such precise timing that they seemed almost mechanical in their execution. The sound echoed strangely in my studio, as though the very air had become somehow thicker, more resistant to sound. Upon opening the door, I found myself face to face with a gentleman of indeterminate age, impeccably dressed in a black frock coat and silk cravat, both of which seemed to absorb what little light remained in the day. His posture was perfect, almost unnaturally so, and he leaned ever so slightly on a silver-topped cane that I would later notice made no sound when it touched the floor. "Mr. Harrison, I presume." His voice had a peculiar quality to it, like distant bells heard through water. "I find myself in need of your services." The most striking feature of Mr. Vale's appearance was not his silver-topped cane, nor his perfectly tailored attire, but his right eye, or rather, its replacement. Where a natural eye should have been, there sat an orb of what appeared to be blown glass, its surface swirling with colors that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light struck it. The iris was an impossible shade of violet that I knew would present quite the challenge to recreate in oils. What caught my attention even more than the eye's unusual coloring was its movement. While his natural left eye remained fixed and steady, the glass eye seemed to move independently, studying me with an intensity that made me distinctly uncomfortable. I found myself unable to maintain direct eye contact with either orb, instead letting my gaze drift to the elaborate silver handle of his cane. "Do come in," I managed to say, stepping aside to allow him entry. As he passed, I noticed that despite the frigid weather, he carried no warmth about him. Indeed, the air seemed to grow colder in his wake. The temperature drop was so pronounced that I found myself reaching for a shawl I kept draped over my easel for just such occasions. My studio, which had always felt rather spacious despite its modest dimensions, seemed to shrink in Mr. Vale's presence. He moved through the space with a fluid grace, examining my completed works with an attention to detail that both flattered and unsettled me. His glass eye appeared to gleam differently before each painting, taking on hints of the dominant colors in each piece. "Your technique is quite remarkable," he said, pausing before a recently completed portrait of a young debutante. "You capture more than mere appearance. There's something of the spirit in your work." His natural eye turned to me, while the glass one remained fixed on the painting. "This is precisely why I have sought you out." He settled into my best client chair with the same liquid grace that marked all his movements. The leather, which had grown somewhat worn over the years, seemed to become newer beneath him, the cracks and wrinkles smoothing themselves out in a way that defied explanation. "I understand you are quite skilled at capturing the essence of your subjects," he continued, his voice somehow both intimate and distant. "This is of paramount importance to me, you see. I require not merely a likeness, but something more fundamental. I assured him that I always strive to capture more than mere physical appearance in my portraits, though privately I wondered at his choice of words. In truth, his presence had begun to affect my thoughts in strange ways. The familiar objects of my studio, the easel, the paint-spattered dropcloth, the rows of brushes, seemed somehow altered, as though they had aged decades in the span of minutes. "You work by lamplight, I observe," he said, gesturing to my collection of oil lamps with his cane. The silver tip caught the light oddly, seeming to bend it rather than reflect it. A wise choice. Daylight can be so revealing, so unforgiving in its clarity. He proceeded to outline his requirements for the commission. He would sit for me over the course of 7 evenings, no more, no less. The sessions would begin precisely at sunset and conclude when he deemed appropriate. The payment he offered was extraordinary, enough to keep me in comfort for several years. I found myself wondering why a man of such obvious means had sought out my modest studio rather than one of the more fashionable artists in better parts of London. "There is one final condition," he added, tapping his cane gently against the floorboards. The sound it made was wrong somehow, not the sharp rap of metal on wood, but a soft, wet noise that made me think of earth being packed onto a coffin lid. "You must promise to complete the portrait entirely by lamplight. No natural light must ever touch the canvas during its creation." It was an odd request, but far from the strangest I had encountered in my profession. I agreed readily enough, and we set the first session for the following evening. As he rose to leave, I noticed that the leather of my client chair had aged dramatically where he had sat, developing cracks and wear that hadn't been present before. That night, I dreamed of colors I had never seen before, shades that existed somewhere between the known hues of my palette. I woke feeling as though I had spent hours mixing paints, my fingers aching with phantom movements of brush and knife. The first sitting began exactly at sunset the next day. Mr. Vale arrived precisely on time, his knock once again. 3 perfect beats that seemed to resonate through my bones. He took his position with practiced ease, arranging himself in the chair as though he had sat for 1,000 portraits before. As I began to sketch his basic form onto the canvas, I noticed something peculiar about the way the lamplight played across his features. Shadows seemed to linger a fraction too long in certain places, as if reluctant to relinquish their hold on his flesh. His glass eye caught the light in impossible ways, refracting it into colors that shouldn't have existed in the warm glow of oil lamps. "Tell me, Mr. Harrison," he said, breaking the customary silence of a sitting, "do you believe that art can capture more than mere appearance? That perhaps, in the right hands, with the right subject, a portrait might contain something of its subject's very essence?" I murmured some polite agreement, too focused on capturing the unusual angles of his face to engage fully in philosophical discourse. But as the evening wore on, I found myself increasingly disturbed by the way his glass eye seemed to follow my every movement, even when his head remained perfectly still. That night, I dreamed of painting with oils that moved beneath my brush like living things, colors that whispered to me in voices just below the threshold of understanding. I woke to find my sheets soaked in sweat, the taste of turpentine bitter in my mouth, though I had cleaned my brushes thoroughly before bed. The second sitting brought new strangeness. As I mixed my colors, I noticed that they seemed somehow richer than before. The basic umbers and siennas I used to underpaint his flesh tones had taken on a depth I had never achieved. When I wiped my brush clean, the rag seemed to writhe slightly in my hands, though I told myself it was merely a trick of the lamplight. During our third session, I began to notice changes in my studio. Between Mr. Vale's visits, my other clients appeared increasingly pale and insubstantial, as though they were merely sketches of themselves. Their portraits, once completed, seemed flat and lifeless compared to the growing vitality emerging in Mr. Vale's painting. It was during the fourth sitting that I first noticed the change in my paints. The colors seemed to have a life of their own, mixing themselves on my palette when I wasn't looking directly at them. The red I used for his cravat had a wetness to it that made my fingers tremble as I applied it to the canvas. The blacks were so profound they seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. "The work progresses well," Mr. Vale observed, his natural eye fixed on some distant point while his glass one swirled with colors I had never seen before and could not hope to name. "I can feel it taking shape." And indeed it was. The portrait was unlike anything I had ever created. There was a depth to it, a sense of movement just below the surface of the paint that both thrilled and terrified me. When I looked at it for too long, I could have sworn I saw his chest rise and fall with breath. The fifth sitting brought with it a profound change in the atmosphere of my studio. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost gelatinous around the canvas. My other paintings began to fade, their colors leaching away as though Mr. Vale's portrait was somehow feeding on them. I found myself having to touch the frames occasionally to assure myself they were still solid. During our sixth session, I noticed that Mr. Vale's appearance had begun to change subtly. His skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, while the portrait seemed to become more substantial with each brush stroke. The glass eye's movements had become more pronounced, sometimes rotating completely in its socket to follow me when I moved to mix new colors. On the night of our final sitting, I arrived at my studio well before sunset to prepare. The canvas seemed to pulse with anticipation, layers of paint shifting subtly, even though I hadn't touched them since the previous session. My finest brushes, normally so reliable, trembled in their holder as though caught in a draft, though the air was perfectly still. As I waited for Mr. Vale, I found myself studying his partially completed portrait with growing unease. The paint had developed textures I had never created, surfaces that seemed more like flesh than oil and pigment. The glass eye I had painted with its impossible colors appeared to have gained depth, as though I could reach into the canvas and pluck it from its painted socket. His arrival was heralded by the usual 3 knocks, but this time they seemed to echo through the studio with a resonance that made my teeth ache. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. The elegant gentleman who had first commissioned me was now almost skeletal in his thinness, his skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Only his glass eye remained unchanged, swirling with colors that seemed to leak into the air around it. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice now carrying undertones that reminded me of stone grinding against stone. He took his position in the chair, which had begun to show signs of severe aging, the leather cracked and peeling, the wood beneath gone gray and brittle. As I worked, I noticed that my paints had taken on new properties. The oils moved beneath my brush like living tissue, warm and yielding. The colors blended themselves, creating shades I had never seen before and could never hope to recreate. My hands seemed to move of their own accord, guided by some force I didn't understand and feared to contemplate. "You feel it, don't you?" Mr. Vale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The transfer has already begun." I wanted to ask what he meant, but my tongue seemed frozen in my mouth. The portrait was nearly complete now, lacking only the final details around the glass eye. The painted figure had taken on an impossible solidity, while Mr. Vale himself seemed to become more insubstantial with each passing moment. "The eye," he said, rising from his chair with a grace that belied his apparent frailty. "The final touch must be precise." Before I could protest or move to stop him, he reached up and removed his glass eye with practiced ease. The empty socket behind it was not the pink flesh I expected, but rather an endless void that seemed to stretch into infinite darkness. The eye itself pulsed in his hand, its colors swirling faster now, like a storm seen from above. He approached the canvas, leaning heavily on his cane, which I now noticed left small, scorched marks on the floorboards where it touched. With deliberate slowness, he pressed the glass eye against the painted surface of his portrait's right eye. The transformation began immediately. The glass eye seemed to melt into the paint, but rather than running or smearing, it merged perfectly with the portrait. From that point of contact, a change began to spread across the entire canvas. The oils transformed before my eyes, taking on the texture of stone, while retaining every detail I had so painstakingly created. The stone was like no marble or granite I had ever seen. It seemed to have depth beyond its surface, layers upon layers visible beneath its polished face. Veins of color moved through it like blood through flesh, and the whole piece radiated a cold light that filled my studio with shifting shadows. "Magnificent," Mr. Vale whispered, his empty socket somehow less disturbing than the terrible smile that spread across his face. "You've done it perfectly." What have you done?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "What is this?" He turned to me, and I saw that his remaining natural eye had gone completely white, like marble. "My dear Mr. Harrison, I have done nothing. You are the artist who has captured my essence so completely. And now I shall live forever, preserved in stone, while this temporary flesh can finally be discarded." He gestured to himself with a flourish of his cane. To my horror, I watched as Mr. Vale's physical form began to wither before my eyes, aging decades in moments. His skin grew papery and thin, his hair white and brittle. All the while, the stone portrait seemed to pulse with an inner light, the glass eye gleaming with vital energy. "The portrait was never meant to capture my likeness," he said, his voice now dry and crackly. "It was meant to capture my life itself. And you, my talented friend, have performed the task admirably. For centuries, I have sought an artist capable of such work. The others, well, their attempts line the halls of various galleries. Mere paintings, nothing more. But you have given me true immortality." As the last words left his lips, his body crumbled to dust, leaving only his expensive clothes and silver-topped cane in a heap upon my studio floor. The stone portrait, however, had taken on an impossible vitality. The glass eye seemed to follow me as I moved about the room, and in certain lights I could swear I saw the hint of a smile playing at the corners of the carved lips. In the days that followed, I tried everything I could think of to destroy the portrait. Chisels shattered against its surface, and fire left it unmarked. Acid simply rolled off its surface like water from wax. Each attempt seemed to amuse the figure in the portrait. I could feel its satisfaction in my failures. Eventually, I did the only thing I could think to do. I walled it up behind a false panel in my studio. But even now, years later, I know it remains there, waiting. Sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, I imagine I can hear something moving behind that wall. The sound of stone grinding against stone, and beneath that, a whispered laugh. I never paint portraits anymore. Indeed, I haven't touched a brush since that night. My old studio remains locked and empty, though I still pay the rent faithfully. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy off the Thames, I fancy I can hear 3 sharp knocks, evenly spaced, echoing up from the street below. I never answer the door anymore, but I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that somewhere out there, others still do. And in galleries and private collections across London, there are paintings waiting for the right artist, the right moment, the right eye to bring them fully into our world. So, if you find yourself commissioned by a gentleman with a peculiar glass eye, I implore you, turn him away. For art may indeed capture the essence of its subject, but some essences are better left uncaptured, some portraits better left unpainted, and some eyes should remain forever closed. Story 8. I'm a photographer, self-taught to be exact. At the moment, I'm working in my dark room to develop some pictures for my portfolio. The pictures are resting in trays filled with chemicals, one a mixture, another acetic acid, and the last with ammonium thiosulfate. That's one thing that I learned about photography. You have to wait. You have to be patient. I have a confession to make. I don't like showing people my work. I know that sounds ridiculous. What kind of photographer doesn't want to show the world his work? Isn't that the point of photography? To catch a moment in time and share it? Well, I'm just embarrassed. You see, I don't like rejection. Not after I was rejected by Insight, a popular people's magazine. Their claim is that they only post articles and artwork from average, everyday people. I got my hopes up, and I shouldn't have. I remember being so excited, so eager when I met with the senior photographer of Insight. It was a dream come true. There was small talk at first and coffee, but then I showed him my portfolio. I watched as his demeanor changed, and our meeting ended shortly afterward. He claimed that I didn't have a photographer's eye, that my work was unoriginal, useless to the magazine. I refused to believe him at first. One person's opinion shouldn't mean anything, but after hearing those words, I eventually accepted them. I didn't have a photographer's eye. Photographers tend to have themes in their work. Some take pictures of nature, while others photograph buildings or weddings. My work was cliched. It was a mixture of everything: puppies, couples, flowers, and sunsets. It was terrible, unoriginal. I was on the verge of giving up. I found my photographer's eye, despite it being in an untraditional way. My passion returned, and I realized what my theme would be. Eyes. Hear me out on this. Eyes are the windows to human emotion. There's happiness, fear, anger, surprise, sadness, and so much more to capture in photographs. Eyes are the perfect subjects, but not in the literal sense. It's not easy taking pictures of someone's eyes. Most people don't like getting their picture taken, and people are always on the move. I'm not some creep. After I photograph someone's eyes, I let them know about it, and I explain my project to them. Most people don't appreciate it, so a lot of my pictures are of frustration or surprise. Anger is pretty popular too. You know, I've felt so confident lately that I'm letting my girlfriend tour my dark room today. She's never seen it before, and I'm so excited to show her. By now, my pictures have finished developing, and I pinned them on a clothesline to dry. These pictures were taken in a local bakery. I love going there. Everyone is so happy, especially Sarah, a young woman that works there. We're familiar with each other because I frequent the bakery often. She's happy to pose for me if I buy a few sweets. It's a pleasant exchange. I'm just glad that she humors me. Despite my recent confidence, there has been a few doubts in the back of my mind. It took me a while to figure it out. It's my girlfriend. I take photographs of her often, but her eyes aren't as happy anymore. I don't understand why. I compared recent photographs to photographs of her eyes from a few months ago, and there has been a deliberate change. Something must be bothering her. I tried to ignore it at first, but it's starting to interfere with my work. I feel like it's because I've been spending a little more time with my camera than with her. She's always understood in the past, though. I cross over to a dark cabinet filled with developing equipment, lenses, and Polaroids. I nudge an old camera aside and remove a giant glass jar filled with preservatives. I set the jar on the counter and smile down at its contents. In the red glare of my safe light, I see two eyes staring back at me. I brush my finger across the surface of the jar and take a deep breath. It's a simple procedure. Well, I wouldn't call it a procedure without all the necessary equipment. Trust me, though. I've done this before with the senior photographer of Insight. He's how I got my photographer's eyes. And don't worry, I found suitable replacements for him. 20/20 vision, too. I do regret the scarring, though. I was a bit nervous, so I had a shaky hand when amputating them. To my knowledge, the procedure was extremely successful. I mean, look at me. If I operated on myself, I can operate on another person. I know it will work. With Sarah's eyes, my girlfriend will finally be happy again. I hear footsteps on the stairs, and I smile as I hear a knock on the dark room door. Come in, sweetheart.